I have slides. Yes, you can record. Share my slides. Okay. Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for inviting me. And I grew up in Northeast LA, but I've lived in Altadena since about 2009, 2008, something like that. So either way, it's been pretty devastating to see what recent fires have done to not just Altadena, but Southern California in general. But Altadena has been particularly hit hard. And in fact, I think I'll talk just a tiny bit about that. So the title of the talk is Avian Community Response to the Tuna Fire in the Verdugo Mountains. And I would say I'm one of the only few people to have done this, but there hasn't been a whole lot of research published about the effect that wildfire has on birds, particularly in the kinds of ecosystems that we have in Southern California. So like chaparral ecosystems or coastal sage scrub type ecosystems, which are kind of special ecosystems, really unique to California in certain ways, which are very fire prone in both natural and unnatural ways. And so there hasn't been a ton of research published about this. And so it really does warrant pretty special attention. There's a pretty vast body of literature on the effects of wildfire on plants, particularly in California or within the sort of California floristic province of the Western United States. But there hasn't been a huge emphasis on trying to study birds. And we might ask questions about, well, why? Well, I mean, birds aren't terribly difficult to study, but it is very time consuming to study wild animals. And, birds move around a lot. And we could also ask questions about how many people are interested in studying birds these days to the level where they would collect quantitative data and use it to really make, meaningful analyses about the kinds of influence wildfire really does have on birds. So that's kind of the overarching theme behind this kind of research. What I want to do throughout the course of this talk is first go through a little bit of the history of wildfire in Southern California, at least the more recent history of wildfire. And I'll talk a little bit about the research that I've done, the project I did in the Verdugo Mountains, and the results of that project and how those results can be compared to a couple other projects that other folks have published. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about how we can take our thinking of fire ecology and translate it into the world of urban ecology. So with that, I'd like to start by talking about the 2009 station fire, which is one that particularly sticks in my mind. It was the biggest wildfire in recorded history in Los Angeles County. It's over 160,000 acres. Devastated most of the western San Gabriel Mountains, actually led to 2 deaths of 2 firefighters. And it was considered an arson fire, so there was a homicide investigation. I'm not sure if they ever caught the person who started the station fire, but nevertheless, it was a pretty devastating fire with lasting effects. If you drive up into the San Gabriel Mountains today, you could still see some of the effects of this fire, particularly in more forested type ecosystems. And so this was a pretty big deal at the time. As you can see from this image, it was a very smoky fire. I mean, as fires are smoky, but the smoke of this fire was pretty wide-ranging with its large size. And this fire burned for a pretty long time, August to October. So this was an active fire for a significantly long period of time. Then there, of course, is the Tuna Fire, which is a bit more recent in 2017. And this affected the northern part of the Verdugo Mountains. So this map here shows where the Verdugo Mountains are located, sort of north of Burbank and west of La Cañada and south of San Tejunga. And this is not the only fire to have impacted the Verdugo Mountains in recorded history, but it's certainly the most recent fire to have impacted the Verdugo Mountains in recent history. And it's a wildfire that came awfully close to urbanization. In fact, there were many evacuations of these various communities surrounding the Verdugo Mountains that ensued as a result of this fire, including where my mom lived at the time, which is kind of interesting. And so this was not as large of a fire as the station fire, but it certainly was impactful and caught a lot of people's attention because of how close to the city it was. That same year, in a very similar location, we had the Creek Fire. So this was just a couple months after the La Tuna Fire. sort of on the north side of the Sunland Tujunga community. The creek fire burned in the sort of lower elevations of the San Gabriel Mountains, again prompting evacuations of these communities that lived in this area. So for that area to be sort of impacted by two successive wildfires in the same year during the same season was a pretty frightening thing. And the creek fire was about twice the size of the Tuna Fire, but it didn't impact urbanization as much. It did burn down into the Hanson Dam area where Lakeview Terrace is, but for the most part, it burned up into the San Gabriel Mountains. But nevertheless, you can see this image here of the smoke of the creek fire as the creek fire jumped over the 210 freeway. That was kind of an alarming thing that happened. And then the following year, we get to the Woolsey Fire that really had a pretty significant impact on the Santa Monica Mountains. And this one probably is much more widely publicized, I would say, because it was far more destructive. There are a lot of people that live in the Santa Monica Mountains, and a lot of properties were threatened or even outright destroyed by the Woolsey Fire. A lot of sensitive kinds of habitat, like oak woodlands, for example, were very negatively impacted by the Woolsey Fire. And this fire basically encompassed almost the entire area that makes up the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. And so if you don't know, the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area is administered by the National Park Service, and this really kind of was, a game changer for the way that they managed their lands and had to deal with conservation of biodiversity on those public lands. And this was a pretty big fire, nearly 100,000 acres. So the Santa Monica Mountains were really quite negatively devastated by the Woolsey Fire. And as you can kind of see from the image on the right and the map on the left, this fire burned all the way down to the coast. And it burned as far inland as the Simi Hills and the mountains above Chatsworth, and burned almost all the way into Simi Valley. So this fire certainly has lasting effects still today. If you were to drive up into the Santa Monica Mountains, you can still see the effects of the Woolsey Fire for sure. And then even more recently in 2020, the Bobcat Fire happened. And the Bobcat Fire, as far as I understand, started because of failed Southern California Edison transmission lines in the San Gabriel Mountains. And so Edison has transmission lines that run through corridors in the San Gabriel Mountains. One of them, I think, involves San Gabriel Canyon, which is shown here where these two reservoirs are, sort of at the southern extent of this fire. And I think that's where the fire started. And this fire spread quite rapidly. Within maybe just a couple days, I think, it managed to go from very close to the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains all the way to the desert, to the high desert over here on the north side of the San Gabriel Mountains. So communities like Vallermo and Juniper Hills that are not too far from Palmdale or Victorville, those communities ended up becoming impacted by the Bobcat Fire. So like this image here on the right shows a Joshua Tree juniper woodland that was impacted by the Bobcat Fire. And in fact, if you drive up Angeles Crest Highway today on the route that sort of connects La Cañada over to Wrightwood, you will drive through an area that was very, very significantly impacted by the Bobcat Fire. And unfortunately, a lot of old growth forest was burned up at high elevations by this fire. So the point is that there were a whole bunch of different kinds of ecosystems in the San Gabriel Mountains that were affected by this fire. Chaparral ecosystems, riparian ecosystems, pine oak woodlands, mixed conifer forest, and then even like Joshua Tree woodlands on the desert facing side. So the Bobcat Fire was pretty destructive in terms of how it impacted natural ecosystems. It didn't have as much of an effect on urban areas, although I shouldn't discount the fact that many people did lose their properties in the areas of Juniper Hills and Vallermo, but those were the main communities that were affected by it. But nevertheless, this was also a pretty big fire, over 100,000 acres. And as this fire progressed through the San Gabriel Mountains and it started moving to the west, really the only thing that kind of stopped it from spreading to the west was all this area that had burned in the 2009 station fire. And so there wasn't as much fuel once the Bobcat Fire sort of reached the station fire perimeter. And so that kind of prevented that fire from becoming larger than it ended up being. So the Bobcat Fire certainly has some lasting effects and is a pretty sad thing to see the results of if you go up to the higher elevations where there are these old growth forests. And then we come to the most recent Los Angeles County wildfire, at least around here where I live, which is the Eaton Fire in 2025. And I believe this also started because of failed transmission lines that Southern California Edison has here in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains above Altadena. And I think a lot of us who were here at the time, we were experiencing a pretty significant Santa Ana wind event, which most of Southern California was experiencing at the time. And so I think those of us who had lived around here for a while thought, another Santa Ana wind event, no big deal. It'll die down in a day or two. And then all of a sudden a fire started. And then I think a lot of us thought, oh, well, hopefully it'll just burn up into the mountains and hopefully it could be managed and it'll run into the Bobcat fire burn area, which we can see here on the right, or it'll run into the station fire burn area, more to the northwest. But surprisingly, it found its way down into the community of Altadena, and I'm sure most folks in the audience are aware of the devastation that the Eaton Fire had on the community of Altadena. So not only did it burn a significant amount of wild space on the south-facing slopes of Mount Wilson, which is sort of around here, but it found its way down into the city of Altadena and burned approximately 60 to 65% of the city of Altadena. I think more than 9,000 structures were destroyed in the city of Altadena. This image here on the bottom is an aerial shot. I think it's a drone shot. It really kind of illustrates the extent of the devastation that the Eden Fire had on the community of Altadena. And, if you were to visit Altadena today, you could drive through here and see block after block after block after block of homes that were destroyed by this fire. And I'll also mention that that destruction happened very rapidly. It probably happened in about less than 10 hours, something like that. I evacuated here at Altadena around 4 o'clock in the morning, came back at noon that day, and the damage was done. So that fire made very, very quick work of sort of finding its way from the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains all the way down to where the cities of Altadena and Pasadena meet, and that's kind of where it stopped. And then it also kind of found its way down to the foothills of Sierra Madre and Arcadia, but it didn't devastate those communities nearly as much as it did Altadena. So anyway, that's kind of a handful of memorable and impactful wildfires that we've had in Los Angeles County, going back about 16 years. And from this information, you're probably realizing, geez, a significant proportion of the wild spaces of Los Angeles County have burned in the last 16 years, and it's true. So the fires have been large in some cases, they have been frequent, and we could also start asking questions about how severe they were. And in a lot of cases, they probably were quite severe. And so LA County is one place that's really, really not only extremely urbanized, but has had to deal with a lot of wildfire. And so this brings us to thinking about this concept that's been proposed by folks in the field of ecology that we call the wildland-urban interface. And maybe you've heard of this before. The wildland-urban interface basically describes this sort of area where there's a transition between really true urbanization and really true wilderness. And as you might have experienced in your own travels, there's usually not a clear-cut boundary between urbanized areas and wild areas. There's usually more of a gradient or a gradual change in the sort of composition of the landscape as one moves from a super urbanized area to a completely wild area. And so this is an area that we call the wildland urban interface. And we can try to categorize this with some different descriptions, whatever, basically according to how much development is there in a given space as one moves from wild areas to more relatively urbanized areas. And then we can start talking about how these different categorizations or these different areas that have different amounts of urbanization are more or less susceptible to the effects of wildfire. And not surprisingly, we could think of wild spaces as having the highest probability of burning and more urbanized spaces as sort of being more in this like ember zone, if you want to call it that. But either way, in these kinds of communities where there are lots of homes that are sort of developed very, very close to these wild spaces, we have an area where there's a pretty high risk of homes being affected by wildfire. And of course, that's very much what we see here as a result of the Eaton Fire, Although what makes the Eaton fire kind of exceptional is that the wildfire found its way kind of beyond the wildland-urban interface into real, true urbanization. And that's something we don't see that often. So that's kind of interesting. And likewise, when we talk about the Tuna Fire, we again, as I mentioned before, are talking about a fire that was very much happening right at the wildland-urban interface as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of biota that characterize the wildland-urban interface, at least with respect to plants and birds. So here in Southern California, anyway, there are these coastal sage scrub and chaparral plant communities you've probably seen before. And sometimes these communities are very pristine and are in large areas that haven't been impacted by urbanization. But in other cases, these coastal sage scrub and chaparral plant communities are very, very close to the wildland-urban interface, or not, if not, in fact, part of the wildland-urban interface, such as we see in the Santa Monica Mountains of Los Angeles County or in the Verdugo Mountains. We also have things like oak woodlands that frequently are part of the wildland-urban interface. And there are a number of different oak species in Southern California that can comprise oak woodlands, such as coast live oaks or valley oaks. This image here shows an endangered oak species, the Engelmann oak. If you've ever heard of it, these are Engelmann oaks at the Los Angeles County Arboretum, which were not planted there. They are a naturally occurring population of oaks, but they occur right smack in the middle of a very heavily urbanized area. And so these are kind of like relict plant communities in a certain way that probably had a much larger distribution in areas that are now just very urbanized. And then we have these riparian corridors that interface or that we could find in the wildland urban interface. And like the Los Angeles River is probably one of the most classic examples of one of these that we have in Los Angeles County, where, you know, there's this tremendous sea of urbanization, but then you have this river going through it. And this river has become channelized, but that channel is sort of this magnet for various forms of wildlife. And it harbors riparian vegetation, so riparian tree species like sycamores or cottonwoods, or in some cases maybe alders, and in some cases also maybe some non-native tree species that can do well in these environments, all can be found along this corridor. And of course, this provides habitat for a whole bunch of wildlife, such as birds, for example. And so this kind of serves as a corridor of habitat from more wild spaces down into this more urbanized area. So despite the fact that the wildland-urban interface is very much dominated by urbanization, there still are patches of wild, naturally occurring biotic communities that we can find in them. And these turn out to be really, really interesting places to understand ecological processes as they're happening in a context that's a little bit different than they would happen in sort of normal, fully intact wild spaces. We can also, again, discuss birds and the wildland-urban interface, and I'm sure, you know, lots of us who love birds like to go out into the wilderness and look for birds, but we're not always in the wilderness, and so we spend time in the city looking for birds, and we can find lots of interesting bird species in the city. And as it often turns out, some of the bird species we can find in the city are a lot different than the kinds of bird species we find outside of the city. And of course, sometimes we can find bird species that seem to be able to occur either in the city or out in the more wild spaces, and they don't have a particular preference one way or the other. But anyway, things like house finches seem to have done really, really well to undergo their normal life history patterns in urbanized areas. They are a naturally evolved bird species in North America, but they still can do pretty well with urbanization, and they've also apparently done pretty well to expand their normal range into increasingly more urbanized areas, I think more toward the eastern part of the United States, but they seem to be pretty well adapted to dealing with urbanization. Things like these red-whiskered bulbuls, these are native to Asia, and somehow or other they were introduced to North America and particularly into California, and they seem to do really well in urbanized areas. Not so much in the fully wild spaces, but in this area where we sort of see a transition between urbanization and sort of wild spaces, we tend to find these birds, these non-native birds, and they seem to do pretty well in those kinds of habitats. Likewise, more familiar native species like California scrub jays or dark-eyed juncos, these are birds that seem to do pretty well in urbanized areas or semi-urbanized areas, not too difficult to find. Ravens, of course, some people might consider them a nuisance. I think they're cool, but they're another example of a species that's obviously very well adapted to a multitude of different wild habitats, but also seems to have found a way to do pretty well in urbanized areas. And then, of course, we can't forget about aquatic bird species. Again, as I mentioned, we have segments of habitat in the wild-urban land interface, such as the Los Angeles River, for example, where we might find things like great blue herons, which is, kind of surprising to find smack dab in the middle of the city, less than a couple miles from downtown Los Angeles. But nevertheless, it is not impossible to find birds like this in those kinds of areas. So this is just kind of some background on how we might think about the biota of the wildland-urban interface with respect to plants and birds. So I studied the bird populations, or at least one bird population, in the Verdugo Mountains. And as I mentioned, the Verdugo Mountains are nestled here sort of north of Burbank, west of La Cañada, south of Sunland Tujunga, and east of the San Fernando Valley. The Verdugo Mountains are a pretty rugged mountain range. This image on the left sort of illustrates how quickly the slopes of the Verdugo Mountains rise up out of the San Fernando Valley. And the highest peak of the Verdugo Mountains is about 3,000 feet. And so it is high enough to receive snow occasionally, maybe not every year, but if we get a cold enough storm, these mountains will receive some snow. And the plant community composition of these mountains is almost predominantly coastal sage scrub and chaparral, so a lot of vegetation that kind of looks like what I showed you here. To a lesser extent, we might find some patches of oak woodland and some patches of riparian habitat, but not a lot. And these mountains also turn out to be a pretty important corridor of habitat for certain wildlife species, such as mountain lions that have been spotted on a fairly regular basis, moving through the Verdugo Mountains, whether they're traveling from the Santa Monicas to the San Gabriels occasionally or not. This sort of island of habitat in the sea of civilization seems to represent an important habitat for this sort of charismatic mammal species here. Some people might not agree with me that it's charismatic. They might think it's a threat to their pets. But nevertheless, this is an important piece of habitat for a native mammal species. Things like these gray foxes that have been spotted in the Verdugo Mountains. This is a game camera that somebody has set up in this area. So we know that this turns out to be not just an important sort of sea of vegetation, a sea of native vegetation, and maybe not also just an important place for birds, but an important place for other forms of wildlife as well. So this is where I ended up studying birds. And basically what I did was I selected this transect that's shown here with all these colors. And I'll explain what those colors mean in a moment. But this is about 1.5 kilometers, maybe 2 kilometers long transect. It's all along a hiking trail that sort of skirts the northern section of the Verdugo Mountains, kind of here above La Tuna Canyon. And initially, I never really thought about wildfire when I started studying birds in the Verdugo Mountains. I just wanted to study the kinds of bird species that you could find in this coastal sage scrub and chaparral kind of habitat. And so this turned out to make a pretty good living laboratory for doing that. And so I spent some time doing these bird surveys, and then all of a sudden, a year later, less than a year later, the place burned in the 2017 Tuna Fire. And at the time, I was a student at Cal State Northridge. I was an undergrad, and I ended up taking a course in avian ecology. And the professor for the class, avian ecology, required all the students to do a project on studying birds, some kind of project. It was pretty open-ended. So I proposed, well, why not study the effects of the Tuna Fire on the composition and the diversity of that bird community along this particular transect? And so that's what I ended up doing. So just to kind of give you a sense of the impact that the Tuna Fire had on vegetation, this picture on the top left shows what that transect looked like before the fire during the spring of 2016 when I was doing this initial set of bird surveys. And this image on the bottom shows what vegetation looked like after the Tuna Fire, maybe about 18 months or so after the Tuna Fire, when I resumed doing bird surveys once again. And this map with all these different colors represent burn severity. And I'll show you some graphs that illustrate this a little bit better in a moment. But basically, my co-author and I ended up categorizing burn severity into 3 different categories: low, low, and moderate high. And so we have a sense of how much variance there is in the burn severity that impacted this particular transect. So how did we do this? Well, in fact, I didn't really do this. My co-author, Richard Rockman, did. But basically what he did was he took remote sensing methods and used satellite imagery data that basically takes a measure of spectral reflectance, which, long story short, without getting into all the nitty-gritty details of how that's done, we can measure the greenness on the landscape and use that to make comparisons of different areas and figure out the relative abundance of vegetation cover from one area to the next, I should say. And that's done using something called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. So NDVI is basically a measure of the amount of greenness that can be measured, assessed from satellite imagery on the landscape. And so here on the left, we see a measure of NDVI taken along that transect, this same transect here, taken along that transect immediately before the fire happened, at all of those different little square pixels. So we averaged them out here. And then a measure of NDVI taken along that same transect after the fire. And what we can see is a very, very significant decrease in the amount of vegetation cover that resulted along that transect following the 2017 Tuna Fire. And so we know that, yeah, vegetation was pretty significantly impacted there by the fire. And then, as I mentioned, we had categorized burn severity into sort of low severity, moderate low severity, moderate high severity. And this is done using a slightly different metric known as the difference normalized burn ratio, or DNBR. And this is kind of just like taking the difference in the amount of vegetation cover before the fire compared to the amount of vegetation cover after the fire. And we can look at that difference and use it to assess the severity of the burn. And so what we see is that along the transect where I surveyed birds, not a lot of the pixels that were analyzed using remote sensing had low severity. Most of them had moderate low severity, and comparatively fewer had moderate high severity. And so there is some variation in the effect that this fire had. The burn was not uniform across that transect. And so that's what all these different little colored squares are trying to illustrate. Where was the fire more severe compared to other areas? And so just to kind of paint the picture a little bit more clearly, the kind of vegetation that was most commonly found along that transect before the fire were things like black sage, or California sagebrush, or California buckwheat, or laurel sumac. These are pretty commonly observed shrub species that we'll find in coastal sage scrub. It's sometimes associated with chaparral as well.
We lose you, Shay. There you go.
After the fire, the plant community completely changed, and instead we started to see, as vegetation recovered, things like deerweed, which is a native perennial subshrub, but also a lot of invasive annual plants started to pop up. So things like red brome, which is a Mediterranean grass species, or things like short pod mustard, which is another Mediterranean mustard. These are both invasive species. They tended to dominate the landscape in the Tuna Fire burn area after the fire happened. And so there was really a significant change in vegetation. And so this sort of starts to beg the question, well, how might this also be related to changes in the bird community? So basically, I set out to answer 2 research questions. Did the bird diversity and sort of evenness increase or decrease after the Tuna Fire? And in order to figure that out, I use this thing called the Shannon-Weaver Diversity Index. You don't really need to get lost in how it's calculated, but basically it's a measure of not just how many species of birds were there, but what their relative abundances were. And so the idea is, as species richness increases and the relative abundance of those species is increasingly more even. That is to say that the counts of the bird species are very similar. Diversity starts to go up. And so if we could have a lot of species, but if the community is dominated by just one of them, it's not considered nearly diverse as if the community is sort of equally dominated by all of those species. So that's how I assessed diversity. And then I wanted to know how the structure of feeding guilds and the kinds of foraging substrates that the birds were using might have changed as a result of the fire. And so to do this, I basically ended up categorizing birds into the kinds of feeding guilds that they could be classified into. So this image on the left kind of illustrates these different examples of feeding guilds, like are things granivores or frugivores or scavengers or nectarivores, for example. And then what kinds of substrates did bird species use? Did they tend to be species that would, use tree bark, or in this case, shrub bark as a substrate to feed on, or do they glean off of branches? Or do the bird species that are observed tend to feed in midair, like these aerial species, for example? Or do they tend to feed on the ground more, for example? And so ultimately, I ended up categorizing all of the different bird species that I observed into these different feeding guilds and foraging substrate categories to get a sense of how that might have changed. And then the sampling protocol that I used to survey birds was a basic area search method. So I would walk along that transect with a pair of binoculars, and I would record point counts of all the bird species that I could find. And for those of you that have birded, generally this is effective within a radius of about 30 meters. Beyond that, it's kind of hard to identify birds, even with binoculars, unless it's something as large as a turkey vulture. Or sometimes I would also be able to identify birds by sound. So certain bird species are not too difficult to identify by sound. Some, of course, are, if you want to get into the world of flycatchers. But things like, spotted towhees or California quail is not too difficult to identify by sound. And I ultimately ended up doing 6 of these surveys before the Tuna Fire, which totaled up to about 14 hours of surveys, and then an additional 6 surveys after the fire, which also was roughly about 14 hours of surveying. And this yielded 37 different species of birds that I was able to identify along that transect using this method. So what did I find? Well, it turns out that there was no significant effect of the Tuna Fire on the diversity of the bird community. So this graph on the left shows pre-fire bird diversity and post-fire bird diversity. There's not really any significant difference there, nor was there a significant difference in evenness. Again, this is a measure of how equal are the relative abundances of all the species that were recorded. There wasn't much of a difference there either. So that's kind of interesting. We didn't really see that this fire impacted the diversity of the bird community. And I thought it was interesting to look at how this compared to the results published by Mendelson et al. In 2008. They had studied the effects of the 2003 wildfires in San Diego County on bird community diversity and found that in almost every single case that they studied, there wasn't really an impact or a significant change in diversity either. And so they studied these 5 different plant communities: chaparral communities, coastal sage scrub, grasslands, oak woodlands, riparian communities, and they did this at these 2 different elevations. And the only plant community where they detected a significant increase in bird diversity was in coastal sage scrub, but all of the other communities didn't really have any significant changes in diversity. So this is kind of interesting. One thing we can take home from this is that it doesn't seem like wildfire, at least in these kinds of plant communities, usually would have a very significant effect on the diversity of bird communities. And this kind of points towards the fact that bird communities, maybe in these kinds of plant communities, are somewhat resilient to fire. And that's kind of interesting. The changes in the feeding guilds and foraging substrates, however, did turn out to be very significant. And so we can see the different categories I use, so carnivores, granivores, insectivores, nectarivores, and omnivores. We can see that the counts of carnivores didn't really change, but we can see that the counts of granivores really went down, and that's not surprising because birds that depend upon seeds for food aren't going to have probably nearly as many to feed on after a fire. Insectivore counts didn't really change a whole lot. Nectarivore counts didn't really change a lot, but omnivore counts went up really significantly. So that's kind of an interesting result. What's going on? Well, maybe bird species that can kind of shift their diet with a response to fire can tend to do a little bit better in areas that burn compared to bird species that can't shift their diet. And then if we look at the changes in the foraging substrates, we can see that there was a significant increase in counts of aerial feeding birds, which isn't terribly surprising, a significant increase in counts of generalist foraging birds, which is kind of similar to the result of seeing an increase in the counts of omnivores. We didn't really see a significant change in the counts of ground feeding birds, and shrub foraging bird counts seemed to go down pretty significantly, which again isn't surprising. There weren't a whole lot of shrubs around after the Tuna Fire, so birds that usually feed on shrubs probably weren't nearly as attracted to that environment for feeding. This is kind of interesting to compare to the results of this paper published by Newman et al. In 2017, where they were trying to understand how either prescribed burns or basically these mechanical mastication efforts that were used to remove vegetation might impact both feeding gills and foraging substrates in bird communities, also in chaparral habitats. This was done in Mendocino County. And they surveyed these areas within about 5 years of having these treatments performed. And they found slightly different results. So they found that there were some significant decreases in counts of insect feeding birds and birds that were sort of generalist feeders, and significant decreases in shrub foraging birds, which is similar to my results. And in contrast, they found that seed-eating bird species increased in numbers, and ground feeding birds increased in numbers, and also aerial foragers increased in numbers. So there are some similarities in their study to the results of mine. But on the other hand, I think it's important for us to recognize that this is not natural wildfire. These are prescribed burns or mechanical mastication. And so the effects of these kinds of treatments on not just vegetation, but on the bird communities might not be expected to be exactly the same as the effects of a natural wildfire. So anyway, it's interesting to look at how an experimental approach to understanding how changing vegetation impacts feeding gills and foraging substrates yields results that are similar in some ways and different in others to results we see as a result of natural wildfire on those same kinds of counts. And then one of the most interesting, or another really interesting result that comes out of my study, it corroborates well with a paper published by Hargrove and Unit in 2018, is that we tend to see bird species that can be classified into sort of 3 different response categories: negative responses, neutral responses, and positive responses. And so what does this tell you? It tells you that some bird species don't deal with wildfire very well. Some bird species seem to be not affected by wildfire at all, and some bird species seem to benefit from wildfire. That's kind of interesting. And so if we first think about birds that are negatively affected by wildfire, these are things that are mostly granivores and shrub foragers. And so, not surprisingly, again, bird species that depend upon seeds for food and forage on shrubs tend to experience pretty significant declines following wildfire. So things like wren tits or bush tits, which are both shrub foraging species for the most part,
Hi,
or things like house finches,
I'm watching
which
a program.
which are granivores for the most part, so they feed on seeds for the most part, or even things like American crows, which don't really fall into those categories, but they seem to have been negatively impacted by the Tuna Fire as well. Hargrove and Unit studied how the bird communities were affected by the same fires in 2003 in San Diego County, and they did this over a much longer time period, but they also saw things like California thrashers maybe being kind of negatively affected by wildfire in those areas. And then we could look at species that had more neutral responses, and these are bird species that are mostly insectivores or ground foragers. So things like California towhees, as some people like to call them, California towhees or California quails that do spend a lot of their time foraging on the ground, didn't really seem to be negatively impacted by the La Tuna fire. Things like ash-throated flycatchers that were observed by Hargrove and Unit in the wildfires of San Diego County didn't really seem to be significantly impacted by those wildfires. Things like California thrashers in my study in the La Tuna Mountains didn't seem to have any significant changes in their counts, although again, notice that Hargrove and Unit did notice a negative effect of fire on California thrashers in San Diego County. So, maybe the response of thrashers to wildfires is kind of variable and dictated by other factors. But nevertheless, these kinds of species that have these kinds of foraging strategies don't seem to be particularly negatively impacted by these kinds of fires. And then species that we see have positive responses to wildfire are things that are mostly omnivores or generalist foragers, things that can forage on a variety of different kinds of substrates, or things that are aerial foragers. So for example, western kingbirds, which are aerial insectivores. I never saw any western kingbirds in the Verdugo Mountains before the La Tuna fire. And then 18 months after the fire, I'm out there doing these bird surveys, and there are western kingbirds all over the place. Likewise, I never saw any lazuli buntings before the La Tuna fire in the Verdugo Mountains. 18 months after the La Tuna fire, there's lazuli buntings all over the place. And again, these are bird species that have different kinds of diets and use different kinds of substrates for their foraging. Things like yellow-rumped warblers and white-crowned sparrows. Yellow-rumped warblers are for the most part, generalist foragers that feed on insects, they increased in numbers after the La Tuna fire. White-crowned sparrows, who generally feed on the ground and are omnivores, increased in numbers after the La Tuna fire. However, it has been suggested that part of the reason why we might see yellow-rumped warblers and white-crowned sparrows increase in numbers after the La Tuna fire was simply because they're migratory birds. And we can ask the question, did they show up after the fire because of the fire, or were they simply just migrating into the area as part of their sort of normal annual migration, and they happened to take advantage of the La Tuna burn area for habitat? So we don't exactly know, but for whatever reason, these two species definitely increased in number immediately following the La Tuna fire. And likewise, if we look at the results from Hargrove and Unit, within 5 years of studying the effects of the 2003 wildfires in San Diego County, they're also recording significant increases in counts of lazuli buntings. So these lazuli buntings are a great example of a fire-following bird species. And so I think what some of these results kind of leave us going home with is this idea that the response of birds to wildfire, probably at least in coastal sage scrub and chaparral type habitats, really kind of depends upon the severity of the burn and the time since the burn. And those two factors are probably two of the most important factors that dictate how a bird community is going to respond to wildfire. And really high intensity burns could have a much different effect on bird community composition compared to low intensity burns. And then again, the amount of time it's been since an area burn can likewise be expected to probably have something of an effect on both the diversity and the composition of these bird communities. And so that's kind of the take home from studies of the effects of wildfire on bird communities in coastal sage scrub and chaparral, kind of at the wildland urban interface. The last thing I want to talk about here, just with the last couple minutes I have, is how, I've talked to you about the science of fire ecology. And there's this other science we have called urban ecology. And following the Eaton fire here in Altadena, for me anyway, this has sort of opened up this opportunity to take those two ecological disciplines and put them together into something we might call urban fire ecology. And I don't think a whole lot of research has necessarily been done on this, but two areas that I think are worth focusing on is what are the effects of urban fire ecology on plants, and what are the effects of urban fire, I should say urban fire on plants, and what are the effects of urban fire on birds. And so I've been trying to make an effort to go around the eat and burn area and study this to a certain extent. It's not very easy, and I can tell you it's not very pleasant. And I can also tell you that not a lot of people seem to appreciate this very well. And one has to be careful where they trod in trying to document the response of plants to the Eaton fire within urbanized areas. But it's really pretty fascinating to see what's going on. In all these different lots that have burned around Altadena, we're seeing vegetation respond a lot here in the first spring following the Eaton fire. And a lot of the vegetation that's coming back is ornamental vegetation, and that's pretty interesting. These are plant species that people had planted, had cultivated on their properties that burned during the Eaton fire, but a lot of these plant species either weren't killed because they had below ground tissue that survived, or maybe they had some seeds in the soil, in the seed bank. Whatever the case may be, we're seeing all this interesting ornamental vegetation respond to the fire in positive ways. And so also we could talk about how some of these plant species are native or some of them are not native. So for example, this image here at the top shows coast live oak, a California native tree species that is positively responding to the effects of the Eaton fire well within the confines of an urbanized area. These are, young coast live oaks that are already resprouting. Or things like the coast redwood. And so obviously coast redwood is not native to Southern California. It's native to sort of Central and Northern California on the coast, but plenty of people have planted redwoods around Southern California, and certainly within the Eaton burn area in Altadena, we've seen areas where redwoods were affected by the fire, but they are starting to resprout immediately in the first spring after the fire. And it's not surprising because if you know anything about redwoods, they are a fire-adapted species. And so even cultivated redwoods seem to be able to respond to wildfire just as well as wild populations of redwoods. Other California natives we can see are things like the Matilla hippopi, and these don't occur naturally in the Altadena area, but people have planted them all over the place. And lots of them have burned, and lots of them are resprouting vigorously with in response to the wildfire here in the first spring after the wildfire. And so this is yet another cultivated native species that's already probably adapted to wildfire. But there are also some not so great things popping up like sweet alyssum, if you know what this is on the bottom right, Lobellaria maritima. These are commonly cultivated plants that are not native to California that people love to put in their yards, and they're already well known to escape cultivation and establish natural populations. In fact, they are considered an invasive species. Well, these things are popping up all over the place in Altadena right now, and they are establishing new populations, presumably from the seed bank, that didn't even previously exist. And so this is one area where I think people should be focusing their thinking about how this fire is affecting the urban landscape with respect to how it's really an opportunity for invasive species to start spreading. So that's just one interesting observation that I've made so far. And then, of course, what about birds? Well, the best analysis that I was able to come up at this point in time with how the Eaton fire has affected bird populations was to look at about a year of bird observations taken from the community science website iNaturalist, and see how this might sort of shed some light on how patterns in avian community composition and diversity has changed. So the map on the left shows bird observations recorded in Altadena, which is outlined in red, from June 2024 to January 2025. And likewise, the map on the right shows similar observations from January 2025, which is when the fire happened, to right now, right up to this month. And what we can see is that the number of observations isn't really that different. There are slightly fewer early this year for whatever reason. This could have to do with some level of sort of observational bias, or the fact that it's not been the easiest thing to travel around Altadena trying to record bird populations at the moment. but also that the number of species recorded is not really that different. 58 species that were recorded in the last 6 months of the 2024, 46 species that were recorded in the first 6 months of 2025. Not a really striking difference. And so this kind of suggests that species richness of the avian community in Altadena hasn't really been affected by wildfire that significantly, if not, maybe not significantly at all. But maybe the composition has. And so I started trying to look at, well, which species were common before the fire, which ones didn't seem to have their observational counts affected by the fire, and which ones did we not really see, or which ones did we not really see before the fire at all that we are seeing now. And so on the right are just a few select examples, things like mourning doves, for example, which again are ground foraging, grain-eating birds or seed-eating birds. Their numbers observations of them seem to have decreased pretty significantly following the Eaton fire. Things like red-tailed hawks, which are aerial carnivores, observations of them didn't seem to have changed significantly at all. So maybe they're having sort of a neutral response to the fire. And then things like western bluebirds. Western bluebirds had not been observed in Altadena very frequently. Their observations weren't zero, but they hadn't been observed in Altadena very frequently until all of a sudden the Eaton fire happened, and we're seeing counts of these western bluebirds going up. What are the foraging strategies and feeding guilds and foraging substrates of western bluebirds? They are generalist omnivores. And so just like we saw here with a positive response, things like lazuli buntings are generalist omnivores. So are western bluebirds. And so there seems to be something going on where generalist omnivore bird species tend to have a positive response to wildfire. So this offers kind of just a snapshot at the effect of wildfire really within an urban area and how it seems to have affected both vegetation and the bird community. And I think this is just really the beginning of a whole area of research that people should be getting into, trying to understand the effects of the Eaton fire. So that's basically the end of my speech. I think the take-home messages we have are that there has been an increasing frequency of wildfire in Los Angeles County, in some cases maybe an increasing severity of wildfire in Los Angeles County. It offers an opportunity for invasive plant species to really take off, at least initially, if not permanently, following these kinds of wildfires. They can affect a whole diversity of different kinds of ecosystems, and we have a sense of how maybe bird communities tend to be pretty resilient in the face of wildfire. They maybe have a tendency to maintain their diversity, and maybe that's because birds are sort of already pre-adapted to be able to utilize different kinds of ecological niches that are affected by wildfire, but that certainly we could expect to find a change in the composition of these different feeding gills and foraging substrates that we would observe in the bird populations as a result of wildfire. And that seems to be a pretty consistent observation that can be made in multiple studies and in multiple different environments. So with that, I'd just like to make a couple acknowledgments. I'd like to first recognize the journal Western Birds, who published this research I did on the Tuna Fire. If you want to read all the details about this, it makes for great reading before you go to bed, puts you right to sleep. I want to give a very special thanks to Richard Rockman, who's the co-author on this paper, who put time and effort into the remote sensing analysis that gave us a sense of the magnitude of how vegetation was impacted by the Tuna Fire. Dr. Fritz Hertel, who is a professor of biology at Cal State Northridge and a great bird lover, who kind of helped push me on the path of actually embarking on this project. And Philip Unit, also, who is the editor for Western Birds, who made a lot of valuable comments on the manuscript and on the whole research protocol. He was a pretty good resource too. And then I just want to recognize that many of the photographs I showed you came from either iNaturalist or the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Some of those photographs were mine, but give credit where credit is due. And lastly, in case you're wondering where all of the classification schemes came from, how did I decide if birds were going to be categorized into one particular feeding guild or one particular foraging substrate? the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has a tremendous database on the life history accounts of every single, or just about every single wild bird species in the state of California. And so I was able to use that information as a reputable basis for classifying bird species. So that's it. Thank you for your time, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions that you have.
I think I see one question in the chat. Shane, do you have access to that?
Yep. Do I know if studies planning humans affecting the plant changes after fire or restoration? Well, obviously, in more protected areas, there are people who are trying to make cognizant efforts to make sure that the effects of fire on plant communities are not negative. But if the question is maybe more asking like, are there inadvertent human effects on plant communities following wildfire, say in coastal sage scrub and chaparral? Almost certainly, especially in areas where maybe recreation is a possibility. People have the opportunity to introduce invasive species into disturbed areas without really realizing it. For example, I worked with the National Park Service years ago, and we were very cognizant about not moving mustard seeds around. So we'd always have to empty our shoes out and stuff. But the average hiker is probably not really doing that. So if that answers the question. I'm sure there are people out there who have a mindset about this, but I'm sure the majority of people don't really think about it.
Did that answer your question, Catherine? If you can unmute yourself. I don't know if she's within hearing right now. Well, anybody have any other questions before we say good evening? Well, I want to thank you, Shane, for this talk. It was very enlightening, a lot of very good information and beautiful slides, I have to say. I didn't expect to see so much beauty, especially post-fire. There's already a lot of growth, and that's fantastic. Even in Altadena, you've had just a few months for all of that to start growing again. It's amazing.
It is pretty fascinating. And I
Yeah,
think it should be documented.
it shows how resilient nature is, huh?
Yes, both plants and
Definitely.
birds, and probably all kinds of other species too that are harder to study.
Yeah. Well, that's reassuring. So I wanted to thank you again, and I know you put a lot of work into this. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And I wanted to thank everybody for being here this evening. We now have a couple of months off from having the monthly presentations. So we will be back in August. We're going to be away for, I'm sorry, we're going to be away for July, and August we'll be back in September with our monthly talks. And if anybody has any other questions for Shane, you can reach him through his email, which I'd be glad to give you. So be sure to do that. So thanks a lot, Shane. It's good working with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Uh-huh.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye, Margot. Bye-bye.